Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, I guess, depending on where you sit. My name is Craig Colburn. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at FocusPoint International. For those of you that may be confused by that, FocusPoint and AFIMAC are sister companies. We're owned by the same parent company, if you will, here in the States. There's a lot of information that I want to get through today. Hopefully I can get it all done within an hour. And if there's any time for questions, I'm happy to field those. And if not, I would encourage any of you with questions to reach out to me by email. I'll provide you that information at the end of the show here. Kind of the idea behind this webinar is to provide an understanding of duty of care. I know there's different meanings to different people at different verticals. This clearly is going to be specific to the corporate travel world. To get you to start thinking about potential exposure to your organization and to help sort of develop a basic roadmap for your corporate travel program. A lot of this information may not be new to many of you on the call, but others on the call may be less familiar with it. And hopefully I can provide some clarity behind this. Just a couple of brief comments about who I am. I've been in the business. I retired out of law enforcement a lifetime ago, it seems. I've been on the private end of things for about the last 28 years now. I've been a security director for two privately held companies and have been responsible for the development of their security programs. I've also worked prior to FocusPoint for a couple of other global consultancies. And prior to founding or co-founding FocusPoint in January of 2011, I was the Vice President of International Operations for a previous consultancy, where I was responsible for several international offices and all international operations. I think I skipped one here. Let me sort of set the stage here, if I may. There was a recent article, an interview done by Business Travel News, and there was a gal, Lucy Motska, who was hired by FTI Consulting as their global travel manager. A couple of months after she was hired, the German wings crash between Barcelona and France, killing all passengers, occurred. At the time, she did not know whether any of their employees were on the flight. There was no mandated policy within FTI Consulting to utilize their travel management company that they did have in place. And only about half of their employees organizationally knew that the TMC actually existed. She was brought up in front of the board, and she was only basically able to guarantee to a level of about 60% that none of their employees were on that flight, which made the board clearly very nervous. After that discussion, there were further discussions, and FTI decided to mandate a policy requiring employees to book travel through their travel management company. That actually didn't occur until about December. And what drove that final resolution was the Paris incident. So what is duty of care? You hear a lot of people talking about this. A lot of people think that here in the States there are laws specific to duty of care. There are not. Most of the lawsuits that you may hear about occurring here in the United States specific to duty of care is centered around the workers' compensation laws in each state and OSHA. There are several lawsuits pending today. There have been several lawsuits adjudicated in the past. You may be aware, in most states here in the United States, employers tend to lose these lawsuits or settle before they even get to court. As indicated earlier, the two relevant sources, again, are OSHA and the workers' state comp laws. I'll read this. Obviously, you can read it yourselves, but OSHA's general duty clause mandates that in addition to compliance with hazard-specific standards, all employers have a general duty to provide their employees with a workplace free from recognized hazards likely to cause death or serious physical harm. OSHA also requires most large businesses to implement an emergency management plan, and corporations are subject to significant liability if they do not meet certain basic obligations. You may have heard also of the UK Corporate Manslaughter Act. Now, this was one of the first laws actually enacted clearly in the UK. And since 2008, there have been 16 cases with 12 convictions. I wanted to put some statistics up here. These are recent statistics from a couple of different publications and associations that track this type of thing. Business Travel News. A poll of 204 travel buyers in January indicated that 71% tracked travelers using a travel management company, which is itinerary-based. It's itinerary data. 30% use credit card data and 12% use GPS tools that tap into the traveler's mobile devices. So that's GPS cell platforms. And 17% aren't tracking their travelers at all. After the Paris attack, clearly that drove a lot of businesses to rethink their strategies, look at their policies, their procedures, and see where they could strengthen those or develop them. It didn't have them at all. 32% reviewed their tracking tools, and the same number evaluated whether to expand their tracking policies. Nearly 10% who did not use GPS tracking were considering it, and 40% took no action at all. So today, we live in a very reactive society. Our industry is no different. So most corporations still take a very passive approach to this. Security tends to be a cost center when looking at it from a financial perspective. And oftentimes, unless you can show a return on investment, or if you find yourself in the unfortunate situation of being brought before a court because of an incident occurring, generally there are no changes made. Going back to my mentioning of the itinerary-based travel tracking through the TMCs, there's problems with both the itinerary-based model and the GPS tracking model. The itinerary-based tends to, you know where somebody's supposed to be, but you don't actually know if they're there. If there was deviation midstream for a variety of reasons, you won't necessarily know where your traveler is. Bear with me just a second, if you would, please. So some of the things that you should be asking of your employees, and all of these components make up a total travel risk program, if you will. Have you provided your employees with adequate training? Do you have well-defined policies and procedures? Have you conducted a comprehensive all-risk hazards assessment? Do you have a crisis management program? Do you have a crisis management plan? Do you have a journey management team? And do you provide country-specific briefings to your travelers prior to traveling? let me go back and give you a couple of examples. And I'm going to read these. It's a little tedious, so I apologize for that. But it's important that you understand. I'm going to bring up a couple of cases that occurred involving U.S.-based multinational companies. This will give you kind of a better idea of how employers think, how employees think that have been victims, potential victims during business travel, and how in some cases the courts are ruling. The first example is Kahn versus Parsons Global Services Limited. The issue of workers' compensation applying overseas was addressed in the case of Kahn versus Parsons Global Services. In this case, the plaintiff, a British citizen and employee of defendant Parsons, which was based in Washington, D.C., signed an employment contract under which he agreed to work as an accountant for the defendant in Manila. The agreement contained a clause requiring Mr. Kahn to accept workers' compensation benefits as full and exclusive compensation for any compensable bodily injury, occupational disease, or death resulting therefrom arising in and out of Mr. Kahn's employment. Shortly after arriving in Manila with his family, Mr. Kahn was kidnapped while walking back to his hotel. He was held for approximately 3 weeks and went through a harrowing ordeal during which he was tortured and ultimately had his ear cut off by the kidnappers. Video footage of Mr. Kahn losing his ear prompted Parsons to pay the demanded ransom, and Mr. Kahn was released. Mr. Kahn and his wife sued Parsons under common law theories of negligence and intentional infliction of emotional distress, arguing that Parsons improperly conducted negotiations with the kidnappers, delayed payment of the ransom, and refused to provide Mrs. Kahn with information about the kidnapping. The plaintiffs argued that the workers' compensation statute was not applicable and that they were not limited to workers' compensation benefits because the kidnapping did not arise out of or occur in the course of Mr. Kahn's employment. The basis of the arguments were that his travel for relocation to Manila had occurred several days before, his job did not involve travel, and his kidnapping occurred on a non-working day after a non-business dinner. Parsons denied the claims, arguing that plaintiffs were limited to workers' compensation recovery pursuant to the employment agreement, precluding any negligence claims or others brought based on common law. The D.C. agreed with the plaintiffs, finding that the injuries did not arise out of or in the course of Mr. Kahn's employment. As a result, Mr. Kahn was permitted to sue Parsons under negligence and other common law theories rather than being limited to remedies under the workers' compensation statute. In so finding, the D.C. Circuit Court discussed similar laws in Virginia, California, New York, and Minnesota. Although not dispositive, Kahn demonstrates that both workers' compensation statutes and broader common law clauses of action under the U.S. law may be used to hold employers liable for injuries sustained by employees while posted internationally. And it goes on here, but you can see that this is the way the courts are looking at these things these days. Again, constant exposure to the employer or dealing with international business travelers. The second one, Hicks versus Waterman Steamship Corporation and Maersk Line. This is actually the Captain Phillips, pertaining to the Captain Phillips movie that everyone's probably familiar with. The plaintiff, steward on a ship who was allegedly injured during his hijacking by Somali pirates, sued under the Jones Act and general maritime and common law, alleging that defendants knowingly sent their employees into pirate-infested waters, knowingly exposed their employees to grave and imminent danger, and did not take adequate steps to provide appropriate levels of security and safety for their employees. This is still being fought, I believe. I don't believe it has been, the court has ruled on this. And there's one that I won't get into now. But the point being that corporations really have to take a close look at the potential exposure they face if they are not showing that they are being diligent in attempting to mitigate any risk to their employees while traveling internationally. travel considerations. Does your journey management team have a mechanism to track employees anywhere they are traveling? Do you have a system in place anywhere they are 24/7? Do you have a system to gather and analyze emerging threats and information which may impact the employees who are traveling? Is there a mechanism to alert traveling employees when you become aware of information which may impact their travel and safety and well-being? Does your company have personnel who are trained to manage, monitor, and respond to emergencies impacting your traveling employees? So as we discussed before, the itinerary-based tracking model, again, you may know where your traveler is supposed to be, but in fact, they may not actually be there. This is very common in large corporations that have large sales forces that travel internationally. We call them rogue travelers. And the sales folks tend to be violate this the most often because at the end of the day, it's all about making money for these folks, which I understand. But what they may do is they will either not book a flight through the TMC originally that may or may not be mandated via policy, or they will divert their travel midstream to make another meeting, this type of thing, and nobody knows that, you know, somebody traveling to you know, somewhere in Europe has diverted, and he's now in Pakistan for a few days to try and conduct some business there. The other problem with that is that even if policies and procedures are in place, mandating certain guidelines, it's seldom that there's any disciplinary actions for violation of those policies and procedures, especially when it involves senior-level salespeople, because at the end of the day, they're the ones bringing revenue into the companies. With the GPS-based tracking, you would at least know that the traveler is in country or where they're at, assuming that their smartphones are still on. The weaknesses behind the GPS system is that you have to be in cell service for it to actually work. The satellite will continue to track, but the data won't be pushed out until that phone is back in cell service. So there are weaknesses to both, which is why more and more folks are actually overlapping them and utilizing both. So employees should receive regular training regarding company policies and procedures that pertain to travel. This can be done through a variety of vehicles, intranets, webinars, whatnot. The journey management team's roles and responsibilities should be clearly defined, and there should be a pre-travel approval process in place, which requires 100% compliance. And a lot of times the way that works is certain countries that are deemed at certain high-level risk require approval before travel can be booked. Employees who are traveling to certain regions of the world should be briefed and receive specific training prior to travel, threat awareness and response, kidnap avoidance and awareness, country or regional specific risk assessments or briefings. Those are normally handled by the security department within corporations. And if many corporations, even the very large ones, have very small internal security programs, so they can be actually developed by human resource, travel managers, mobility teams, and whatnot. Crisis response plans. They're clearly part of an overall crisis management program. They can only be really developed properly after conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. And when I say that, it's really specific to multinationals who have office presence in different parts of the world, looking at those facilities that are traveled to frequently by U.S. travelers or others, determining the risk of, geographic risk of their locations, maintaining a constant and updated level of threat at those locations, ensuring that those locations have proper security protocols in place, these types of things. It's difficult to develop a crisis management plan for every type of incident. We have offices located in geographic areas that are prone to weather events, earthquakes, a whole variety of things. So it's difficult to plan for every contingency, but it's important that you are able to document that you've done the best that you can to help mitigate any issues involving your folks. And again, that goes to the crisis response plans are based on the pre-identified, the critical incidents or events. And again, that goes back to, geographic areas where, again, there might be, might be prone to natural disasters, these types of things. Critical events or incidents are defined by the company during the development of the crisis response plan. These are things which the company has identified as issues which may occur, are occurring, or have occurred, and have a potential to immediately affect the safety and security of the employees, company assets and resources, and even the company brand or reputation, which a lot of people overlook, but that's highly important. What you don't want to do is find your company on the front page of a large newspaper because of an event that occurred involving one of your traveling employees. The critical incidents are really the trigger when making a determination as to whether or not you're going to invoke the crisis management plan, and that's basically, the crisis response plan. When you're looking at a crisis response plan, some of the things that you may be looking at, death of an employee. If you have the death of an employee outside of the United States, what do you do? What protocols do you have in place? How do you get that employee back to the United States? Serious injury or illness of an employee, what medical plans do you have in place? If you have an employee that's kidnapped, what do you do? Do you have a policy in place? Who is a response firm? Same thing, extortion of an employee, which is very common in certain parts of the world, especially down in Latin America. If you have a disappearance of an employee, what do you do? How do you respond to that? Natural disasters, again, medical mishaps. We talked earlier, I mentioned the journey management system or team. The main objective of a journey management system or team is to ensure the security and accountability of all traveling employees at all times. For the very, very large corporations, this is a daunting task. And again, for many of the reasons that I've already cited here. So some of the components of the journey management program. We've already talked about policies and procedures, and I keep harping on this because, in doing many assessments of security programs in the past, one of the things that I constantly find is that most corporations have some policies and procedures in place specific to travel. Some have very good policies and procedures in place, but without question, I would say probably 80 or 90% of those folks violating those policies and procedures, there are no follow-up consequences. And so if it's not driven from the top down, the policy and procedures are really no good. Education, keeping your travelers constantly educated on where they're traveling to, security awareness, the fact that they must remain compliant with the policies and procedures in place specific to the journey management, and why. They need to understand why it's important. Most people out there, they do not have a security mindset. We're used to dealing with these types of things, and we look at things in a different way. Most employees, unless they've been a victim while traveling, don't understand the needs. Think that it won't happen to them, that they're going to be okay until something happens. And then when something does happen and you as an organization don't have the response mechanisms necessary to help them, all of a sudden you're the bad guy. They didn't listen. They decided to, they're down in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they decided to stay at a hotel that wasn't authorized. They decided to go out late at night and party. They got themselves into trouble, and now all of a sudden it's the corporation's fault. But the reality is that when lawsuits like that are brought up, as I indicated earlier, it's more often than not the fault of the employer. Unless you can get into court and show that you have specific written policies and procedures in place, that your employees who travel have signed off on those policies and procedures, been educated, understand them, and it's clear that they were in violation. It's all about documentation and ensuring that your traveling employees have signed off and understand what the policies and procedures are, what they can and cannot do while traveling. The journey management team should have full control and authority to determine whether or not any sort of journey should take place. Again, this goes back to travelers that want to conduct business in high-risk environments. That should be signed off by security or somebody of authority in the company based on predetermined guidelines. And again, you don't know what the risk within a specific country is at the time unless you're following and tracking that, and you have a way of doing that. It should not, prior to getting approval for this kind of travel, it should be the security department's responsibility, or as indicated, human resources, whoever is responsible for that. And they should have the complete authority to deny travel based on the risk of the country being traveled to. The revenue is one thing, but the safety of your personnel is another. And senior management within the company needs to understand that you're not denying travel because you don't want the additional revenue brought into the corporation. It's all about the safety of the employee. Country and regional analysis. This, again, goes back to what I've been talking about. This is where it's very important that you have a mechanism in place that keeps you constantly updated on the threat and risk of countries that are being traveled to. And this information needs to be current. There's a lot of avenues out there to obtain this information. The State Department, the various country governments. Everybody provides this information, but a lot of it is really not analyzed. A lot of it is just data dump information. The U.S. State Department, although the information is good, they have a tendency. There's always a bit of a spin behind that information. And so you have to be careful when you're looking for real threat information. How current is it, and how accurate is it? Travel tracking, again, talked about it. If you don't have a system in place like a TMC, an itinerary-based tracking model, or a GPS tracking model, really the only other alternative is manual tracking. And that requires, obviously, a lot of human effort. That requires several extra steps, and it requires compliance. So that becomes problematic. There also involves an archiving of that information. So if you're tracking your travels manually, there needs to be a document filled out that captures the necessary information. That information needs to be archived. It needs to be provided to if you have a GSOC or an operations center, it needs to be provided to those personnel. So there's several layers to doing it in a manual way. The best system from a capturing of information to utilize is the itinerary-based, backed up with a GPS platform, so you can actually track your folks via their cell phones or sat phones. As I indicated earlier, some of the primary issues and challenges with all of this is obtaining full compliance. If you're looking at tracking, the resistance thus far with the smartphone tracking, quite frankly, is that senior executives in companies don't want you to know specifically where they're at. They don't want to be tracked. I've heard this countless times with companies, but I think that that's starting to change a little bit. You're starting to see more and more people looking at GPS tracking solutions. The reality is that they have the opportunity once they get into country, once they've reported in, they can turn that portion, that tracking capability off. You're not as interested in knowing where they're going when they're in country. You just need to know that they're actually in country, in the country that they're supposed to be. Again, the itinerary-based tracking tells you where an employee is scheduled to be, not where the employee actually is. We talked about the rogue employees, the sales team in particular, although it's not specific to the sales folks. Some people that, again, have an adversity to security tend to do whatever they want regardless. Manual systems, as I talked about, they're cumbersome. The fact that you have to keep them and archive them in one location and then retrieve them if there's an emergency becomes an issue. And does the company have an internal resource that can actually manage, monitor, and respond to traveler emergencies? This just happens to be a screenshot of our system, but this is an itinerary-based traveler tracking where you can enter through a portal. All your travelers are identified, where they're at, where they're supposed to be. Again, this is the itinerary-based model. Airlines, all the information that you need is there to click of a button. Whether they're actually there, again, another issue, but the flight they're supposed to be on, where they're supposed to be connecting, and where they're supposed to be landing, and who's in the air and what countries, and you're able to determine and receive alerts based on and know where in the high-risk countries specifically where your travelers might be. This is the GPS tracking. This is, again, kind of what it would look like. Where your travelers are, what their routes are. A lot of the smartphone tracking platforms now, they keep expanding in regards to their capabilities, what they're able to do, the push and pull of information. You're even able to send out certain documents and require the receiver to acknowledge that they've received them. Again, it's all part of showing that you're being diligent. You provided them information, they've received and accepted that information. And beyond that point, if they do something to violate that, it's on them. One of the things I didn't mention earlier, but one of the things that you're also starting to see is corporations making, as part of this whole program, the whole duty of care issue, because everything is one-sided. So there's now being language written in some corporate agreements, policies, and procedures that kind of flip the coin on their employees and require the employees to follow a specific duty of care. And again, that's all part of the overall, business traveler program that corporations are developing. And they're basically requiring these duty of care programs that employees maintain full compliance. And the whole idea, obviously, behind that is if they get into court, they can easily show that this is what the employees should have been doing, and this is what the employees, in fact, were not doing, and because of that, put themselves at risk. So they're all trying to find ways to limit their exposure. Again, just another screenshot of the traveler tracking piece. You'll see the different arrows, locations, routes, and so on and so forth. This might be a manual way of tracking your employees, and you can see that it just involves a lot of steps. Somebody's got to fill this out, somebody has to archive it, somebody has to approve it, somebody has to move it through the chain and get to the operations center so that if there is a situation, they know where this information can be retrieved and how to hopefully appropriately respond. Again, this just happens to be our portal, a country rating. You can see that this constantly changes and lets you know what this is not today's, obviously, although it may be the same, where the risk rating would be for Brazil, and so on and so forth. So again, this is just one of our portals that allows you to pull that information up. So what do you want to do? You want to conduct an assessment, what we would call a gap analysis of all company policies and procedures. You want to try and determine what exists of anything, what does not exist, creating a gap in the program, and developing a solution that fills that gap. It's no different than the links in a chain. If the chain is missing a link, then it's really not a complete chain. And so if you're ever brought into court and you're required to show the court what you have in place, what you've done to help mitigate any safety issues involving your employees, you want to make sure that all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. Ensure that you have policies and procedures that address international travel and journey management in particular. Educate and train your employees regarding the policies and procedures. And again, this can be done a variety of ways, but it's important that whatever way that is, your employees sign off on having received that education. And this is something that should be done annually at least. Things change, employees get complacent. And so the education and the training should be something that's done on a fairly regular basis, and again, signed off each time that training is provided. Conduct an all hazards risk assessment, and again, that includes your overseas offices. This is important. And this is, again, all part of the overall travel management program, if you will. You want to develop a sound crisis response plan, which includes, responses to critical events and incidents that may or may not, be applicable to a specific geography. And that your employees traveling there through the education process are aware of the fact that you have certain standards in place. You have the ability to respond, if there is a need. And again, get them to sign off on it. Train your crisis management team and others pursuant to your crisis response plan. Does everybody work off the same sheet of music? If somebody's receiving information about an incident involving one of your travelers, do they know who to contact to initiate the proper response? And a response might be a physical response, it may be phone communication, it may be a variety of things, but whatever that is, depending on the situation that's occurring with your traveler, everybody needs to know what that process is. And ensure that your crisis response plans identifies the appropriate resources that can respond globally to your needs. Most companies out there have resources that they utilize. Could be companies like ours. It could be their own personal internal resources. It could be a variety of things. But whatever they are, you need to have the ability to reach out to folks in the countries that the event is occurring, and have them provide the necessary assistance specific to whatever the incident might be. And the world's a big place, right? Nobody has resources everywhere. Most people will tell you that they have resources everywhere, but the reality is that's impossible. So you want to develop a partner that you feel comfortable has the most resources and the most ability to provide services should be needed. Again, as I touched on earlier, establish a journey management team and provide them with the necessary authority to review and approve all international travel. This is really important. Again, there need to be clearly defined areas of authority. There need to be clearly defined triggers that allow or do not allow travel to certain countries, and again, based on the threat at that time of the countries being traveled to. Turkey's a prime example of that. Turkey is a place that I've been to many times. It's a beautiful country, but over the last few years, it's one of those countries that everybody's been watching. And it really hasn't stopped travel, but now it's in a situation where you might want to rethink that depending on where you're traveling to in the country. There are certain areas of Turkey that are clearly not safe to go to now or travel to, and others that are more safe, but security awareness and training if you're traveling to those locations is definitely something that needs to be provided. Ensure that you have a mechanism to monitor and evaluate emerging threats. We talked about this earlier. Make sure that the information you're receiving is accurate and up to date. Some of the information tends to get stagnant, and you'll see it sitting on certain websites for lengthy periods of time. So make sure that whatever you're using, whoever you're talking to is providing, there's really no such thing as real-time information, but you want it to be as close to that as possible. And ensure that your company's adequately tracking your employees doing travel. And again, this is based on the risk that the countries they're traveling to. You might want to, a lot of you probably have traveler tracking in place, one firm or another. Some of you might have GPS tracking in place. And again, that's not being highly used yet, but it's being pushed hard by some companies. And there are many corporations, again, that are taking a second look at it as sort of an overlap to the itinerary-based travel tracking. And again, manual tracking, which I would discourage. There's too many other alternatives out there now, and manual tracking just basically leads to potential issues and things falling through the cracks. Again, this is some of the services we provide under our CAP program, which is our Crisis Assistance Plus program. It's a fully funded travel risk management program. These are the areas of coverage within that membership program that would require potential response. And again, that's all something that's fully covered under fully funded membership. As an organizational CAP member, travel tracking is something that's included in that. My tracking, GPS tracking is something that can be added onto that. Things that we do as a company, crisis response, kidnap ransom response, global investigative response. Again, on the consulting side, risk assessments, gap analysis, things that I've referred to earlier in the discussion. And again, EP services all over the world. This is actually an evacuation, a ground evacuation we did about 6 months ago out of Burundi. We have an NGO client that happened to be there and had an office there with several staff members and dependents, and we ended up doing a ground evacuation based on the threat of political violence. We have no hard loss trigger, as many organizations do. So all we need is the threat of a political violence, and of course, Burundi being in Africa, they tend to run regular cycles of violence throughout the continent. This is no different, and this continues to go on. But we're able to get their folks out before it got as bad as it is now to a surrounding country and shelter in place with them for a couple of weeks, and they did end up going back. But again, if you're not a company, if you're not looking at your travelers, where they're going to, what they're doing, have response mechanisms in place, you may find travelers facing situations like this. That ends the presentation. I hope there were a few things you were able to pick out of it. I know it was a lot of information, some of it redundant to what you already know. But again, the whole idea behind this is to get you, the folks that are listening that may not be part of security, that may be on the HR side, maybe on the travel management side, get you to start thinking about your travelers and how exposed your organization might be if you're not able to demonstrate that you have some of these things in place. If you haven't developed sort of an overall plan specific to your international travelers and show ways that you're helping to mitigate any risk to them while traveling. Again, any questions specific to this that I can answer, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to do that. Our website is down below if you're interested in looking at that. And again, I thank you all for being on the call, and look forward to doing another one. Thanks very much.